In the shadowed corridors of Valdoria Palace, where whispered secrets hold more power than royal decrees, Captain Marcus Thorne has protected the crown for 15 years. But when he discovers a letter that could destroy the kingdom's future, he faces an impossible choice: remain silent and watch an innocent princess fall victim to a deadly conspiracy, or break his sacred oath and risk everything to save her. Some secrets are worth dying for, but this one might be worth killing for. Captain Marcus Thorne adjusted his ceremonial sword as he walked through the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace, his polished boots echoing against the ancient stones. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the floor where he had walked the same path for 15 years. Today felt different, though he couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way the servants avoided his eyes, or how the usual chatter among the court ladies had fallen to nervous whispers. Princess Elena Victoria stood at her bedroom window, watching the gardens below, where her younger sister Charlotte played with their golden retriever. At 19, Elena possessed the kind of natural beauty that made poets weep and diplomats stumble over their words. Her long auburn hair caught the light like spun copper, and her emerald eyes held an intelligence that often surprised those who expected a typical royal princess. But lately those eyes had carried shadows that concerned Marcus more than he cared to admit. The princess had been acting strangely for weeks now. She declined invitations to court functions, spent hours locked in her private study, and jumped at unexpected sounds. Marcus had noticed how she studied faces in crowds as if searching for threats, and how her hands trembled during formal dinners. As her personal guard, he felt responsible for her well-being. But the royal family had made it clear that his job was protection, not investigation. Queen Isabella, Elena's stepmother, swept through the Great Hall with her usual commanding presence. She had married King Frederick 5 years ago, bringing wealth from her family's merchant empire and political connections that strengthened Valdoria's position among neighboring kingdoms. Isabella was beautiful in a calculated way, with platinum blonde hair always perfectly arranged and clothes that cost more than most citizens earned in a year. She treated Elena with cool politeness in public, but Marcus had noticed the sharp looks and cutting remarks when she thought no one was listening. The tension between stepmother and stepdaughter had grown worse since the king's recent illness. King Frederick had suffered what the royal physicians called a minor episode 3 months ago, though rumors suggested it was more serious than the palace admitted. Since then, Isabella had taken on more royal duties, making decisions that traditionally belonged to the king or his heir. Elena, as the crown princess, should have been involved in these matters, but Isabella consistently excluded her from important meetings and state business.
Marcus remembered the conversation he had overheard last week between two senior ministers.
They discussed Elena's unsuitability for rule and suggested that perhaps Princess Charlotte, despite being only 16, might be better prepared for royal responsibilities. The conversation had troubled him deeply, especially since both men were known to be close allies of Queen Isabella. It felt like the beginning of something dangerous, though he couldn't prove anything concrete. The palace buzzed with preparation for the upcoming Harvest Festival, an annual celebration that brought thousands of citizens to the capital. This year's festival would be particularly significant because King Frederick planned to announce his successor during the closing ceremonies. Traditional succession laws favored Elena as the eldest daughter, but whispers suggested the king might be considering other options. The uncertainty had created factions within the court, with some supporting Elena's claim and others quietly backing Isabella's influence over the crown. During his evening rounds, Marcus noticed unusual activity in the royal wing. Servants moved through corridors carrying sealed documents, and several carriages had arrived after midnight bearing visitors who avoided the main entrances. Isabella held private meetings in her chambers that lasted until dawn, with attendees who weren't part of the usual court circle. The secrecy felt wrong, like watching storm clouds gather before a devastating hurricane. Elena's personal maid, Catherine, approached Marcus one evening with obvious reluctance. Catherine had served the royal family for 20 years and had helped raise both princesses after their mother's death. Her loyalty to Elena was absolute, which made her concerns all the more significant. She told Marcus about finding Elena crying over burned letters in her fireplace and about the princess's recent habit of checking her food before eating. Most disturbing was Catherine's observation that Elena had started carrying a small knife in her dress, hidden but accessible. The pieces of a puzzle began forming in Marcus's mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. Elena's behavior suggested she felt threatened, but by whom and why remained mysteries. Isabella's increased political maneuvering could be simple ambition, or it could be something more sinister. The king's illness had created a power vacuum that various factions were trying to fill, but the methods being employed felt dangerous rather than merely competitive. Marcus's own position grew more complicated as he tried to balance his duty to protect Elena with his loyalty to the crown. His orders came through the captain of the royal guard, who reported directly to Queen Isabella in the king's absence. If Isabella was indeed plotting against Elena, then Marcus might be inadvertently helping to isolate the princess he was sworn to protect. The thought kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling while trying to determine the right course of action. The harvest festival preparations intensified as the date approached. Decorators transformed the palace grounds into a showcase of Valdoria's prosperity, with golden banners and elaborate floral arrangements that cost more than most villagers saw in a decade. Foreign dignitaries began arriving for the celebrations, bringing gifts and diplomatic messages that would influence the kingdom's future. Among them were several potential marriage candidates for Elena, though she showed no interest in the political alliances such unions would create. Princess Charlotte seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension surrounding her family. She attended her tutoring sessions, practiced her music, and charmed visiting nobles with her innocent enthusiasm. Marcus often wondered if her youth protected her from the darker realities of court life, or if she was simply better at hiding her awareness. Either way, she represented a complication in whatever schemes might be developing, since any threat to Elena's position would eventually affect Charlotte's future as well. The royal library became Elena's refuge during these troubled weeks. Marcus often found her there in the evening. Surrounded by historical texts and legal documents related to succession laws, she studied with the intensity of a scholar preparing for crucial examinations, taking detailed notes and creating charts that mapped the complex relationships between royal bloodlines and political power. Her research suggested she was preparing for challenges to her inheritance, though she never discussed her findings with anyone. Late one night, Marcus discovered Elena in the palace chapel, kneeling before the altar where her mother's memorial candle burned eternally. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered prayers that seemed more like desperate pleas than traditional worship. The sight broke Marcus's heart and strengthened his resolve to protect her, regardless of the political consequences. Whatever forces were gathering against the princess, she wouldn't face them alone, as long as he drew breath. The first part of this unfolding drama ended with Marcus making a decision that would change everything. As he completed his final rounds before dawn, he noticed a light burning in Isabella's private study. Through a partially open door, he saw the queen meeting with a man he didn't recognize, someone whose presence in the palace at such an hour suggested business that couldn't be conducted in daylight. The man wore expensive clothes but had the bearing of someone accustomed to violence, and Marcus caught fragments of conversation that included Elena's name and references to permanent solutions. In that moment, Marcus realized that Elena's fears were completely justified and that her life might be in immediate danger. 7. The stranger in Queen Isabella's study had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds but left lasting impressions on those who looked closely. Marcus memorized every detail from his hidden vantage point: the silver scar running from the man's left ear to his jaw, the expensive ring on his right hand that caught the candlelight, and the way he moved with the controlled grace of someone trained in deadly arts. Most disturbing was the leather portfolio he carried, thick with documents that he spread across Isabella's desk like a merchant displaying valuable goods. Marcus strained to hear their conversation over the thundering of his own heartbeat. The words came in fragments, but each piece added to a horrifying picture. "The harvest festival provides perfect cover," the stranger said in accented English that suggested origins in the Northern Territories. "Accidents happen during large celebrations. Food poisoning, falling decorations, even simple trips down palace stairs can be fatal." Isabella's responses were too quiet to catch, but her body language showed careful attention rather than shock or revulsion. The captain retreated before discovery became likely, but sleep proved impossible for the remainder of the night. He paced his quarters, weighing options that all seemed to lead toward treason or disaster. Reporting his suspicions to superior officers meant accusing the queen of conspiracy to murder, a charge that would require ironclad proof and would likely result in his own execution if proven false. Approaching Elena directly would violate every protocol of palace service and might endanger her further if Isabella learned of his interference. Dawn brought no clarity, only additional complications. A messenger arrived at first light, bearing news that King Frederick's condition had worsened during the night. The royal physicians were summoned urgently, and word spread through the palace that the king might not survive to see the harvest festival. The timing felt suspiciously convenient, though Marcus had no proof of foul play beyond his growing paranoia about every meal, every medicine, every person who approached the royal chambers. Princess Elena emerged from her rooms that morning, looking like she hadn't slept either. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual careful attention to appearance had given way to a simpler dress and hastily braided hair. She moved through the palace corridors with quick, nervous steps, glancing over her shoulder frequently and avoiding eye contact with anyone wearing Isabella's colors. During breakfast, she picked at her food suspiciously and drank only water from sealed bottles that she opened herself. The announcement of King Frederick's relapse sent shockwaves through the court that mixed genuine concern with barely concealed excitement. Ministers who had been neutral in the succession question suddenly became very interested in cultivating relationships with Queen Isabella. Foreign ambassadors requested emergency meetings to discuss how their treaties might be affected by a change in leadership. Even the servants began choosing sides, with some maintaining loyalty to Elena while others shifted their allegiance to whoever might soon control their wages. Marcus found an opportunity to observe Isabella more closely during the emergency council meeting, called to address the king's condition. She sat at the head of the long oak table where King Frederick usually presided, her posture radiating confidence rather than worry about her husband's health. When ministers discussed the possibility of postponing the harvest festival, Isabella firmly insisted that the celebration must continue as planned. Her reasoning sounded logical. Valdoria couldn't appear weak to its enemies, but Marcus suspected her true motives were far more sinister. Dr. Aldrich Wainwright, the royal physician, provided updates on the king's condition that raised more questions than they answered. The king suffered from what Wainwright described as a rare blood disorder that had suddenly worsened, causing weakness, confusion, and intermittent loss of consciousness. The symptoms could be consistent with natural illness, but they could also indicate slow poisoning by someone with access to the king's food or medicine. Wainwright seemed genuinely concerned about his patient, but Marcus noticed how carefully he chose his words when Isabella asked specific questions about prognosis and treatment. The palace's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive as the day progressed. Conversations stopped when Elena approached, and several courtiers, who had previously been friendly, now regarded her with mixture of pity and calculation. The princess's isolation became more pronounced with each passing hour, as if invisible barriers were rising around her. Even long-time allies among the nobility began finding excuses to avoid private meetings or social interactions that might be interpreted as supporting her claim to the throne. Catherine, Elena's faithful maid, sought out Marcus during the afternoon with information that chilled his blood. She had discovered strange items hidden in Elena's chambers, a vial containing traces of white powder, planted where investigators would easily find it, and forged letters written in Elena's hand that discussed poisoning the king. The evidence was clearly fabricated but skillfully enough to convince those who wanted to believe Elena capable of patricide. Someone was preparing to frame the princess for her father's murder, creating justification for her arrest or execution. The revelation forced Marcus to confront the full scope of Isabella's plan. The queen intended to eliminate Elena permanently, probably during the chaos of the harvest festival when security would be stretched thin and accidents could be easily arranged. If Elena died under suspicious circumstances, the planted evidence would suggest she had been involved in poisoning the king, destroying her reputation even in death. Isabella would emerge as the grieving stepmother, protecting young Charlotte from her sister's treacherous influence, positioning herself as regent until the younger princess came of age. Marcus spent the evening developing his own counter-strategy, using skills learned during his military service before joining the palace guard. He needed to warn Elena without alerting Isabella's network of spies, gather evidence of the conspiracy that would convince neutral parties, and protect both princesses from whatever violence was being planned. The task felt overwhelming for one man, but he knew Elena had few allies willing to risk their lives for her cause. The solution came from an unexpected source. Father Benedict, the elderly priest who served as palace chaplain, approached Marcus after evening prayers with a proposal that demonstrated remarkable courage for a man supposedly devoted to peaceful contemplation. The priest had noticed the same troubling signs that worried Marcus, and his position allowed him access to confession booths where courtiers sometimes revealed more than they intended. Together, they could create a network of loyal palace staff willing to help protect Elena from the gathering storm. Their first recruit was Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, a veteran knight whose loyalty to the royal family predated Isabella's arrival. Geoffrey had served King Frederick's father and remembered Eleanor's mother with genuine affection. More importantly, he commanded respect among the younger knights, who might follow his lead if convinced that treachery threatened the legitimate royal line. Geoffrey's military experience would be crucial if the conspiracy required armed resistance to succeed. The next addition to their growing circle was Margaret Whitmore, the palace's head cook, who controlled access to royal meals and possessed detailed knowledge of every servant who worked in the kitchens. Margaret had watched Elena grow up and loved her like a daughter. making her fiercely protective of the princess's welfare. Her position would allow the group to monitor any attempts to poison Elena's food and possibly gather evidence about the king's mysterious illness. Lady Sarah Pemberton, Elena's former tutor and current companion, completed their inner circle. Sarah had educated both princesses and maintained their mother's traditions within the palace, despite Isabella's efforts to erase all traces of the previous queen. Her noble birth provided access to court circles that might otherwise remain closed to the palace staff, and her sharp intelligence would help them navigate the complex political implications of their actions. As midnight approached, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor before battle. Tomorrow would bring new dangers as Isabella's timeline accelerated toward the harvest festival. The queen clearly intended to eliminate Elena before the succession announcement, preventing any chance that King Frederick might recover enough to name his daughter as heir. Time was running out, and Marcus knew that their small group of conspirators might be Elena's only hope for survival. The second part of their desperate struggle ended with a moment of grim determination. Marcus stood in the moonlit courtyard, where he had first sworn his oath to protect the royal family. Knowing that honoring that oath would require him to disobey direct orders and risk execution for treason. But as he thought about Elena's tears in the chapel and the fear that haunted her beautiful eyes, the choice became clear. Some things mattered more than personal safety, and protecting an innocent princess from murderous ambition was surely among them. The morning of the harvest festival arrived with unseasonable clouds that cast shadows across the usually cheerful palace grounds. Marcus woke before dawn, his sleep having been plagued by nightmares where Elena's screams echoed through empty corridors, while he stood paralyzed, unable to reach her. The symbolism felt ominous, though he tried to dismiss such thoughts as products of stress rather than prophecy. Today would test everything their small group had planned, and failure would likely mean death for Elena and disgrace for anyone who had tried to help her. Princess Charlotte bounded through the palace halls with excitement that seemed almost inappropriate given the circumstances. At 16, she possessed the kind of innocent enthusiasm that could either be genuine or carefully calculated to throw potential enemies off guard. Marcus had grown increasingly uncertain about the younger princess's true awareness of the situation. Her tutors praised her intelligence, and her bloodline gave her the same capacity for political thinking that ran in the royal family. Perhaps her cheerful demeanor masked a sharp mind that understood exactly what was happening around her. Queen Isabella appeared at breakfast wearing a stunning emerald gown that complemented her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup. She moved through the morning rituals with the confidence of someone whose plans were proceeding smoothly, greeting ministers and foreign dignitaries with warm smiles that never quite reached her calculating eyes. Marcus watched her carefully, noting how she positioned herself at the center of every important conversation and how quickly she redirected discussions that might favor Elena's interests. The festival preparations reached their crescendo as thousands of citizens gathered in the palace courtyard and surrounding grounds. Merchants displayed their finest goods in colorful booths. Musicians filled the air with traditional melodies, and the scent of roasted meats and fresh pastries created an atmosphere of celebration that would have been delightful under different circumstances. The crowd size and energy would provide perfect cover for violence, just as the mysterious stranger had suggested during his midnight meeting with Isabella. Elena made her public appearance, looking every inch the crown princess, despite the terror that Marcus knew she felt. Her royal blue dress was perfectly fitted, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate style befitting the occasion, and her jewelry sparkled in the filtered sunlight. But those who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats, and how her smile never quite seemed natural. She played her role beautifully, but the performance clearly exhausted her. Father Benedict delivered the traditional blessing that opened the harvest festival, his words carrying additional meaning for those who understood the subtext of current events. He spoke about protecting the innocent from wolves in sheep's clothing, about the importance of truth in times of confusion, and about the courage required to stand against injustice. Isabella's expression tightened slightly during the prayer, suggesting she understood the priest's real message even if the general audience remained oblivious. The festival schedule included numerous events where Elena would be vulnerable to attack. The princess was expected to walk through crowded areas, sample foods from various vendors, participate in traditional dances, and ride in an open carriage during the afternoon parade. Each activity presented opportunities for accidents that could be fatal, and Marcus felt his anxiety increasing as the day progressed. Their small group had developed plans to counter the most obvious threats, but they couldn't anticipate every possibility. Sir Geoffrey positioned his most trusted knights strategically throughout the festival grounds, giving them orders to watch for suspicious behavior rather than explaining the full situation. The veterans among them had served long enough to recognize when something felt wrong, and their presence provided some measure of security for Elena's movements. Geoffrey himself stayed close to the royal family, his hand never far from his sword despite the supposedly peaceful nature of the celebration. Margaret Whitmore supervised every piece of food that would touch Elena's lips, enlisting loyal kitchen staff to help monitor the complex process of feeding thousands of people while protecting one specific person from poisoning. They had developed coded signals to indicate safe foods in dangerous situations, though the system required constant vigilance that was mentally and physically exhausting for everyone involved. The morning events proceeded without obvious incident, though Marcus noted several suspicious individuals moving through the crowd. The stranger from Isabella's midnight meeting appeared briefly near the music pavilion, watching Elena's interactions with the common people before disappearing again into the throng. Two women in expensive clothes but no identifying badges lingered near the royal viewing platform, their attention focused on the princess rather than the entertainment. Most concerning was a group of men who seemed to be coordinating their movements, staying close enough to strike but far enough apart to avoid detection as a unified threat. Elena's composure began showing cracks during the traditional ceremony, where she accepted gifts from visiting dignitaries. Her hands trembled slightly as she received a ceremonial sword from the ambassador of Astoria, and she flinched when the delegation from Moravia approached with their offering. Marcus realized that the princess was reaching her breaking point, the accumulated stress of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally overwhelming her ability to maintain the facade of normalcy. The turning point came during the afternoon feast when Elena suddenly collapsed after taking a sip of wine from her ceremonial goblet. The crowd gasped in shock as the princess fell to the ground, her body convulsing slightly before going still. Isabella immediately called for the royal physician, her performance of concerned stepmother nearly perfect except for the brief flash of satisfaction that crossed her face when she thought no one was watching. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Marcus knew that the real attack had finally begun. Dr. Wainwright's examination revealed symptoms consistent with poisoning, though he was careful not to make such accusations publicly. Elena remained unconscious but breathing, her pulse weak but steady. The physician ordered her immediate removal to the palace infirmary, providing Isabella with the perfect excuse to take control of the situation. As the Queen issued orders about security and medical care, Marcus realized that Elena was being isolated from anyone who might protect her. The discovery of the planted evidence in Elena's chambers came with suspicious speed, as if someone had been waiting for the right moment to find proof of the princess's guilt. Palace guards reported locating vials of poison and incriminating letters that suggested Elena had been planning to murder both her father and stepmother. The evidence was obviously fabricated to anyone who looked closely, but the crowd's shock and anger made careful examination unlikely. Isabella's response to the supposed evidence was masterfully calculated. She expressed heartbroken disbelief that her stepdaughter could be capable of such evil, but reluctantly agreed that Elena must be confined pending investigation. The Queen's performance convinced many observers that she was an innocent victim of political conspiracy rather than its primary architect. Her ability to manipulate public opinion demonstrated political skills that made her far more dangerous than Marcus had initially realized. The palace infirmary became the center of a power struggle as different factions tried to control Elena's care and access. Isabella insisted on posting guards loyal to her outside the princess's room, supposedly for security but actually to prevent anyone from helping Elena escape or exposing the truth. Marcus and his allies found themselves effectively cut off from the princess they were trying to protect, forced to watch helplessly as their enemies tightened their control. Father Benedict made a desperate attempt to reach Elena by claiming pastoral duty to provide last rites for the dying princess. Isabella initially refused, but public pressure and religious tradition forced her to allow the priest brief access to Elena's bedside. The few minutes Benedict spent alone with the unconscious princess provided their only opportunity to assess her true condition and look for evidence that might expose the conspiracy. The priest's report brought both hope and despair to their small group. Elena was alive and would likely recover from the poison, but the evidence against her was being presented to a hastily convened court that would meet in the morning to decide her fate. Isabella had convinced the other ministers that immediate action was necessary to protect the kingdom from further treachery. The trial would be a formality designed to provide legal justification for Elena's execution. Lady Sarah used her social connections to gather intelligence about Isabella's next moves, attending tea parties and dinner gatherings where court ladies gossiped about the dramatic events. The information she collected painted a clear picture of Isabella's plan to have Elena executed for treason, then position herself as regent for Princess Charlotte until the younger girl came of age. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity, and would likely succeed unless someone could provide definitive proof of Isabella's guilt. As night fell over the festival grounds, where celebration had turned to shocked whispers about royal treachery, Marcus faced the most important decision of his life. Elena would be dead within hours, unless someone took decisive action to save her. Their small group of loyal allies lacked the political power to challenge Isabella through official channels, leaving only direct action as a viable option. Rescuing Elena would require breaking into the palace infirmary, overpowering her guards, and spiriting her away from the capital before Isabella's supporters could organize pursuit. The third part of their desperate struggle concluded with Marcus standing in the shadows outside the infirmary, watching the guards who stood between him and the princess he had sworn to protect. Tomorrow's trial was designed to conclude with Elena's execution, making tonight their last chance to save her. The odds of success seemed impossibly small, but Marcus had learned that some causes were worth dying for, regardless of the probability of victory. The palace infirmary occupied a wing that had been designed for privacy and security, making it nearly impregnable under normal circumstances. Marcus studied the building's layout from every possible angle, noting the positions of guards, the locations of windows and doors, and the timing of patrol changes. Isabella had assigned 6 men to watch Elena's room, all of them handpicked for their loyalty to the Queen, rather than their dedication to the royal family's traditional values. These were not honorable knights who might be swayed by appeals to duty, but mercenaries who would kill without hesitation if ordered to do so. Sir Geoffrey's military experience proved invaluable in developing their rescue plan. The veteran knight had participated in several siege operations during his younger years and understood how to exploit weaknesses in defensive positions. The infirmary's security focused on preventing Elena from escaping, rather than stopping a coordinated assault from outside, creating opportunities that a properly trained team might be able to exploit. Their success would depend on speed, surprise, and the willingness to use lethal force against fellow palace employees. Margaret Whitmore contributed to their planning by providing detailed knowledge of the palace's service corridors and hidden passages. The kitchen staff used these routes to deliver meals and supplies without interfering with the formal activities in the main areas, and some of the passages connected to the infirmary through entrances that weren't guarded. Margaret's position also gave her access to keys that could open doors throughout the palace, though using them would immediately identify her as part of any conspiracy. Lady Sarah's role involved creating a diversion that would draw attention away from the infirmary during the crucial minutes when Marcus and Geoffrey would be attempting their rescue. She planned to stage a dramatic confrontation with Isabella during the evening's formal dinner, publicly accusing the Queen of murdering Elena and demanding justice for the royal family. The accusation would be dismissed as hysteria from a grieving friend, but it would force Isabella to respond publicly and ensure that court attention focused on the dining hall rather than the infirmary. Father Benedict's contribution was both practical and spiritual. The priest would provide sanctuary in the palace chapel if they succeeded in freeing Elena, taking advantage of religious law that protected those who claimed asylum in holy places. More importantly, Benedict had been secretly gathering evidence of Isabella's conspiracy, collecting confessions and testimonies that might eventually prove the Queen's guilt. His position allowed him to move freely throughout the palace and ask questions that would seem suspicious coming from anyone else. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, with no margin for error or bad luck. They would begin their operation during the evening meal, when most of the palace staff would be occupied with serving dinner and cleaning up after the day's festival activities. Sarah's confrontation with Isabella would provide cover for approximately 10 minutes, during which Marcus and Geoffrey would need to penetrate the infirmary, neutralize the guards, rescue Elena, and reach the chapel before pursuit could be organized. Princess Charlotte's role in the evening's events added an element of unpredictability that worried Marcus considerably. The younger princess would be dining with Isabella in the court, potentially witnessing Sarah's accusations and the Queen's response. Charlotte's reaction could either help or hinder their cause, depending on how much she understood about the true situation and where her loyalties lay. If she supported Isabella, she might raise an alarm that would doom their rescue attempt before it could succeed. The hours before dinner passed with agonizing slowness as each member of their group made final preparations for what might be their last actions as free citizens. Marcus cleaned and sharpened his weapons, knowing that he might need to kill men he had worked alongside for years. Geoffrey wrote letters to his family explaining his actions and asking for forgiveness if his choices brought shame on the Blackwood name. Margaret prepared food packages that could sustain Elena during a long journey away from the palace, and Sarah practiced the words she would use to confront Isabella in front of the assembled court. Elena remained unconscious in her guarded room, unaware that her life hung in the balance as competing factions prepared for a confrontation that would determine Valdoria's future. Doctor, Wainwright had stabilized her condition, but he remained under Isabella's control and couldn't be trusted to help their rescue attempt. The physician's loyalty seemed to lie with whoever could best protect his career and reputation, making him more of an obstacle than an ally in their desperate scheme. Evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that should have been invigorating, but instead felt heavy with approaching doom. The formal dinner brought together all the major players in the palace's political drama, creating exactly the kind of gathering that Sarah needed for her planned confrontation. Isabella presided at the head table wearing a magnificent black dress that seemed appropriate for mourning her stepdaughter's supposed treachery, her expression perfectly crafted to suggest wounded dignity rather than triumphant satisfaction. The dinner conversation focused on the shocking revelations about Elena's alleged crimes and the measures being taken to protect the kingdom from further conspiracy. Foreign ambassadors expressed concern about Valdoria's political stability, while domestic ministers debated the legal procedures for trying a princess for treason. Isabella skillfully guided these discussions to reinforce the narrative of Elena's guilt, while positioning herself as the grieving mother figure who must reluctantly seek justice despite her personal feelings. Princess Charlotte sat beside Isabella, her youthful face showing confusion and distress that appeared genuine rather than calculated. The younger princess picked at her food and spoke little, apparently overwhelmed by the dramatic events that had transformed her sister from beloved family member to accused murderer overnight. Her silence could indicate shock, calculation, or simple uncertainty about how to respond to circumstances beyond her experience or understanding. Lady Sarah chose her moment carefully, waiting until the dinner conversation reached a natural pause before rising from her seat with an expression of righteous fury. Her voice carried clearly across the dining hall as she accused Isabella of poisoning Elena and fabricating evidence to support false charges of treason. The reaction was immediate and dramatic, with gasps of shock from the assembled guests and angry denials from Isabella's supporters. The confrontation created exactly the kind of chaos that Marcus and Geoffrey needed for their operation. The rescue attempt began as Sarah's accusations reached their climax, drawing every eye in the dining hall to the unfolding drama at the high table. Marcus and Geoffrey slipped away from the feast using service corridors that Margaret had mapped for them, moving quickly through shadows toward the infirmary where Elena lay helpless under guard. Their weapons were concealed but easily accessible, and both men had mentally prepared themselves for the violence that would likely be necessary to complete their mission. The first challenge came at the infirmary's main entrance, where two guards stood watch with obvious boredom that suggested they weren't expecting trouble. Geoffrey's approach was direct and efficient, using his superior rank to order the men away from their posts on fabricated emergency business. The guards hesitated briefly, clearly uncertain about abandoning their assigned duties, but Geoffrey's authoritative manner and obvious urgency convinced them to obey what they believed was a legitimate order from a senior knight. Inside the infirmary, Marcus discovered that Elena's condition had improved enough for consciousness to return periodically, though she remained weak from the poison and confused about her surroundings. The princess recognized him immediately and understood that rescue was at hand, but her physical condition made rapid movement impossible. They would need to carry her to safety, significantly complicating their escape route and increasing the time required to reach sanctuary in the chapel. The remaining 4 guards presented a more serious obstacle, since they were positioned directly outside Elena's room and couldn't be easily tricked into abandoning their posts. Geoffrey created a distraction by staging an apparent medical emergency in another part of the infirmary, drawing 2 of the guards away to assist with what they believed was a seriously injured festival participant. The remaining 2 men were more suspicious and required direct confrontation that resulted in brief but violent combat. Marcus's military training served him well in the close-quarters fighting that erupted in the narrow corridor outside Elena's room. His opponents were skilled fighters, but they had been expecting to prevent an escape attempt rather than repel a coordinated assault. The element of surprise provided crucial advantage in the brief but deadly encounter that left both guards unconscious and cleared the path to Elena's bedside. Speed had been essential since the sounds of combat would soon bring reinforcements. Elena's rescue required careful handling since the princess remained weak from poisoning and disoriented from her ordeal. Marcus wrapped her in a cloak and lifted her carefully, noting how light she felt compared to her normal healthy weight. The poison had taken a serious toll on her body, and she would need extended recovery time even if they succeeded in getting her to safety. Her whispered thanks gave him strength for the dangerous journey that still lay ahead. The escape route led through service corridors that were normally deserted during dinner hours, but the sounds of pursuit were already echoing through the palace as Isabella's guards responded to reports of violence in the infirmary. Geoffrey led the way with sword drawn, ready to fight anyone who tried to block their path to the chapel. Margaret had positioned loyal kitchen staff at strategic points to provide warnings about enemy movements, but their small network could only do so much against the superior numbers arrayed against them. The fourth part of their desperate gambit concluded as they reached the chapel doors with pursuit closing in behind them. Father Benedict waited inside the sanctuary, with candles lit and religious artifacts arranged to emphasize the sacred nature of the space where Elena would claim asylum. The ancient laws of sanctuary might protect her temporarily, but Isabella's growing power and willingness to violate traditional constraints meant that even holy ground might not provide lasting safety for the fugitive princess. The chapel's heavy oak doors closed behind them with a sound like the sealing of a tomb, though Marcus hoped it would prove to be salvation rather than a final prison. Father Benedict had prepared the sanctuary with meticulous attention to religious law, ensuring that every detail of Elena's claim for asylum would be legally unassailable, even by those who might wish to violate sacred tradition. Candles burned before the altar where Elena's mother had been married, and later mourned, creating an atmosphere of solemn protection that seemed appropriate for their desperate circumstances. Elena's condition remained precarious despite being free from Isabella's immediate control. The poison had weakened her significantly, and Dr. Wainwright's antidotes had only partially countered its effects. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally speaking coherently but more often murmuring fragments of memories and fears that revealed the psychological toll of her ordeal. Marcus and Geoffrey took turns watching over her, while Father Benedict prepared for the confrontation that would inevitably come when Isabella discovered where they had taken the princess. The sounds of pursuit had died away temporarily, but everyone understood that their enemies were regrouping rather than abandoning their objectives. Isabella couldn't allow Elena to survive with knowledge of the conspiracy, especially now that the rescue attempt had demonstrated that the princess had allies willing to fight for her cause. The queen would need to act quickly to contain the damage and eliminate the threats to her carefully constructed plans for seizing control of Valdoria's throne. Lady Sarah's confrontation with Isabella had created exactly the kind of dramatic scene that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. According to Margaret's reports from the kitchen staff who had witnessed the exchange, Sarah had publicly accused the queen of multiple crimes including murder, treason, and conspiracy against the royal family. Isabella's response had been a masterful performance of wounded innocence and righteous indignation, but several observers noted that her denial seemed more calculated than spontaneous. Princess Charlotte's reaction to Sarah's accusations remained the most intriguing aspect of the evening's drama. Instead of immediately defending her stepmother or expressing shock at the allegations, the younger princess had asked probing questions about the evidence and timeline of events. Her responses suggested a sharp intelligence that had been carefully hidden beneath her cheerful exterior, and possibly an awareness of Isabella's true nature that she had kept secret for her own protection. The first test of sanctuary law came when Isabella's guards surrounded the chapel demanding Elena's surrender for trial on charges of treason. Father Benedict met them at the entrance wearing his full ceremonial robes and carrying the ancient staff of his office, his aged voice carrying absolute authority as he explained the religious protections that shielded all who claimed asylum within sacred walls. The guards were clearly uncomfortable about violating church sanctuary, but their orders came directly from the Queen, who had already shown willingness to break traditional constraints. Isabella herself appeared shortly after midnight, accompanied by a select group of ministers and court officials who could witness her attempts to resolve the situation through legal means. The Queen's strategy involved portraying Elena's rescue as additional evidence of conspiracy against the crown. With Marcus and his allies now branded as traitors whose actions proved their guilt, she demanded that Father Benedict surrender all the fugitives for proper trial, promising that justice would be fair and merciful for those who renounced their rebellion. The priest's refusal to violate sanctuary created a standoff that neither side could easily resolve through force. Isabella couldn't order an assault on the chapel without alienating religious authorities throughout the kingdom and possibly provoking popular rebellion among citizens who revered the ancient traditions. But she also couldn't allow Elena to recover and potentially expose the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in eliminating the rightful heir to Valdoria's throne. The deadlock was broken by an unexpected intervention from Princess Charlotte, who arrived at the chapel wearing a simple traveling cloak and carrying a leather satchel that appeared to contain important documents. The younger princess requested private audience with Father Benedict, claiming urgent religious business that couldn't wait for morning. Her presence added new complexity to an already volatile situation, since her support could legitimize either Isabella's position or Elena's claims depending on which side she chose to back. Charlotte's revelation stunned everyone present with its implications for the entire conspiracy. The younger princess had been secretly documenting Isabella's activities for months, gathering evidence of financial irregularities, suspicious meetings, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of the Queen's treasonous activities. More shocking was her admission that she had been deliberately maintaining her facade of innocent ignorance while building a case that could destroy Isabella's credibility and expose the truth about Alina's persecution. The documents Charlotte produced included copies of letters between Isabella and foreign agents discussing plans to destabilize Valdoria's government, financial records showing bribes paid to court officials for their cooperation, and most damaging of all, a detailed contract with professional assassins for Elena's murder during the Harvest Festival. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, providing exactly the kind of proof that Marcus's group had desperately needed to vindicate Elena's innocence and expose Isabella's guilt. King Frederick's mysterious illness gained new significance in light of Charlotte's evidence, which included records of Isabella purchasing rare poisons from merchants in distant kingdoms. The Queen had been slowly killing her husband while simultaneously framing his daughter for the crime, creating a situation where she could eliminate both obstacles to her power while appearing to be an innocent victim of family treachery. The scope and ruthlessness of her planning demonstrated political skills that might have succeeded if not for Charlotte's careful documentation. The younger princess explained her deception as necessary protection against a stepmother she had learned to distrust through careful observation of her behavior. Charlotte had recognized Isabella's ambitions early in their relationship and decided that apparent innocence provided better security than open opposition. Her youth and cheerful demeanor had allowed her to move freely through the palace while gathering intelligence that would ultimately expose the entire conspiracy. Isabella's response to Charlotte's betrayal revealed the calculating ruthlessness that had driven her schemes from the beginning. Rather than attempting to maintain her facade of innocent stepmother, the Queen immediately shifted to threats and intimidation designed to silence her accusers before word of the evidence could spread beyond the chapel. Her transformation from grieving widow to dangerous predator was so complete that even her closest allies seemed shocked by the change in her demeanor. The confrontation in the chapel drew attention from throughout the palace as word spread about the dramatic accusations and counter-accusations flying between the royal family members. Ministers who had supported Isabella found themselves reassessing their positions as Charlotte's evidence made the Queen's guilt increasingly obvious. Foreign ambassadors began considering how the revelation of treachery would affect their nation's relationships with Valdoria, while palace staff whispered about which faction would ultimately prevail in the power struggle. Elena's recovery accelerated as the antidotes finally overcame the last effects of Isabella's poison, allowing her to participate directly in exposing the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. Her testimony about the months of fear and persecution provided crucial context for understanding how Isabella had systematically isolated and terrorized the crown princess while building support for her own claim to power. The princess's courage in facing her stepmother despite her recent ordeal impressed everyone present and strengthened the case for her legitimacy as heir. Dr. Wainwright's arrival at the chapel completed the circle of evidence needed to convict Isabella of high treason. The physician had finally been convinced to reveal his knowledge about the Queen's acquisition of poisons and her instructions regarding the King's treatment. His medical expertise provided expert testimony about the substances used against both Elena and her father, establishing the scientific basis for proving attempted murder alongside the documentary evidence Charlotte had collected. The resolution came swiftly once Isabella's guilt became undeniable to neutral observers. The remaining loyal ministers moved quickly to arrest the Queen and her closest collaborators, ensuring that the conspiracy could be completely eliminated before it could cause further damage to the kingdom. Foreign agents who had been working with Isabella fled the capital rather than risk capture and interrogation, abandoning their plans to exploit Valdoria's political instability for their own nation's benefit. King Frederick's recovery began almost immediately once Isabella's poisoning was stopped and proper medical treatment resumed under Dr. Wainwright's supervision. The king's relief at discovering his daughter's innocence was matched by his fury about Isabella's betrayal, leading to swift legal proceedings that resulted in sentences of death or exile for all the major conspirators. The speed of justice reflected both the clear evidence of guilt and the kingdom's need to demonstrate that treason against the royal family would not be tolerated. Elena's coronation as confirmed heir took place during a ceremony that deliberately emphasized continuity with Valdoria's ancient traditions while rejecting the foreign influences that Isabella had tried to introduce. Princess Charlotte played a prominent role in the festivities, her courage in exposing the conspiracy having earned her recognition as a true defender of the realm despite her youth. The sisters' public reconciliation symbolized the kingdom's recovery from the near disaster that had threatened its future. Marcus received honors that acknowledged his crucial role in protecting the princess and preserving the legitimate succession, though he privately considered his greatest reward to be Elena's safety and the restoration of justice. Sir Geoffrey, Father Benedict, Margaret, Lady Sarah, and all their allies were similarly recognized for their courage and loyalty during the kingdom's darkest hour. Their willingness to risk everything for the truth had saved not only Elena's life, but Valdoria's independence from foreign manipulation. The final chapter of this dramatic story concluded with Elena's formal ascension to her position as crown princess, surrounded by supporters who had proven their loyalty through their willingness to sacrifice for justice. Isabella's failed conspiracy became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of protecting traditional values against those who would exploit positions of trust for personal gain. The kingdom emerged stronger from its trial, with renewed appreciation for the institutions and people who had preserved its freedom when treachery threatened to destroy everything worth defending.